Hello everyone, this is Mini Ninjas. As you probably noticed from the last video, I'm currently testing a little bit of equipment that should let me do a little more interesting video stuff in the near future. But before I get on to that specifically, I actually came across a nice little Super Famicom baseball game of all things, which actually caught my eye here, and when I looked it up online specifically, I was actually curious to find that there's almost nothing talking about Dynamic Stadium. Made by Electronic Applications, published by Sam Productions, I believe, in 1993. But this is a Super Famicom only game. It never made in North American shores, and understandably why, because it seems to cover a series of overall 10 teams, all from Japanese baseball leagues rather than North American teams, which we'd probably be more familiar with. But it's a pity it never came over, because honestly, in terms of gameplay and such, it's actually very reminiscent of kind of older fashioned 8-bit baseball games. When Carlos and I were kind of looking over this, we were thinking to ourselves basically like things like Base Wars and I'm trying to think of a little bit of Bases Loaded, but with much more colorful graphics, and this is actually really well animated and stylized, especially compared to more standard baseball games that we had been seeing up to this point. So since apparently on YouTube there's effectively little to no footage of this actual game, I found all of maybe 3 or so videos tops when I actually tried to look up more on it. Let's take a closer look at the title, like about a few things like the graphics, sound, and various other things. Join me after the cut, ladies and gentlemen.
Play ball!
In terms of graphics, the game fits somewhere between the super deformed style that you would see in a little bit of earlier 8-bit NES entries, and more realistic attempts at certain games or certain appearances, such as what you might see in something like Ken Griffey Jr.'s Winning Run, for example. The main overall viewpoints of the game are the kind of behind the batter view for pitching batting duels, and an overhead view for anything that generally involves both the infield and outfield, and whatever is in between. The stadiums themselves are a little on the nondescript side, mostly because they're not supposed to be based off any sort of real stadium, but they're really nice and colorful, so you don't actually mind too much. In terms of actual kind of character profile, everyone for the most part is fairly generic looking, because once again, it's not supposed to be based too much in realism, and everyone's kind of gonna have a cartoonish, over muscularized proportions. Kind of feeling a bit like a callback to the old NES days, but with much more fluid animation, so it's actually really pleasant to look at for the most part. What this game I believe does really well is when there's kind of a special situation that comes up, like either the diving catch by the pitcher that you saw earlier in this video, or a close call at the plate for whether it's going to be an out or not, the game actually goes out of the way to do some special cutscenes, like we're actually going to see right now with this one, which kind of make whatever's going on feel really special. And this is actually one of the nicest home run things I've seen in one of the baseball games yet up to this point. In terms of music and sound, as you've probably been able to hear the whole time, there's a little bit of actual audio, basically covering your standard baseball terms and plays and such. It's just a nice little addition. The music itself, I actually rather enjoy it. There's not a great variety, mind you, but it's still pleasant to listen to while you're going there. And it's something that some of these games tend to forget, so it's nice to have when it's actually around. Regarding the game's audio and sound, and well, music for that matter, the music for one is actually really nice there. Remind me of what they used to do in the NES days, which admittedly you have heard me say that quite a bit, but when the move from 8-bit to 1632-bit kind of happened there, they seem to have forgotten that you're allowed to have music in some of these titles, and I personally feel the North American baseball games sometimes felt a little lacking. So it's nice to see something that's still got a bit more of an old school base to it that makes it a little more enjoyable to go. In terms of audio, as you can probably been able to hear the whole time, there are some audio clips pretty much calling things like strike balls, outs, and so on. Pretty standard fare. It's nice to have it in there. I'm not gonna say that they should have removed it. They can keep it. It works well, and it sounds well enough for the part. The sound of a baseball being struck or caught sound really nice. It's a pleasant audio cues. So overall, in the sound department, we're doing a-okay here. Regarding the controls, when I got this game, of course I didn't have a manual. I got this as a loose cart, so I kind of had to feel my way around the controls, and it honestly didn't take very long. The controls handle pretty well for the most part. Although there might be one or two cases where you might not want the game to have switched the control or switch what player you're controlling at the time, especially in the outfield. It seems to switch in proximity to the ball who you as a player are controlling, and that might throw you off a little bit, but still it's nothing that's completely game breaking. So overall, not bad. As you probably mentioned, I've been generally positive in speaking of this thing. It's not saying that the game is perfect per se. Unfortunately, because I'm not as used to the Japanese kind of baseball terminology or Japanese baseball market, I'm not very familiar with any of the teams that have been highlighted in this particular title, except maybe one or two. I believe I heard the Dragons. I know they have a team referred to as the Giants in this thing. But of the 10 teams that are selectable, if you're especially in the North American market, you unfortunately probably haven't heard of it unless you're familiar with Japanese baseball, which was quite frankly very popular over there. And I imagine the number 10, compared to what the teams they had available, might have been on the small end, but generally speaking, the teams still feel different enough and are generally visually interesting enough that you don't mind too terribly. It's not like in the previous games or previous generations, you've had all the teams available, or if you did have them, some of them, quite frankly, looked very similar, and if it wasn't for some name changes, you wouldn't have been able to tell the difference anyway. Alright, final thoughts of this particular mini review. The game, very fun to play. Graphically, very nice and colorful, actually really well animated. I was surprised at how well animated this game was. The sound, music, really like it, kind of on point. The music itself, I wish they actually had a few extra tunes in there, but what they have is actually really nice, so no arguments there. Everything feels appropriate, the sounds are really fitting for this sort of title. If you want me to look for a downside, the only downsides I can really think of is sometimes how it switches from one player to the next when you're doing kind of on the defensive end of things. Kind of takes a little getting used to, if anything. And some of the pitching is sometimes a little screwy. Probably the only other thing I can think of as a downside, and this is with a very North American slant, is that I'm not exactly familiar with many of the teams on there, on the actual roster there. But that's because I'm outside the target market, which was clearly just Japan. That's very unfortunate. It's just Japan for the most part, because this was a really well-handled title by Electronic Applications, published by Sammy, as I mentioned earlier. And it's a pity that almost no one seems to know about this game, because it was really only a Japanese-only release. Because I imagine if it had been given a North American release, kind of retitled, or not necessarily retitled, but given a fresh set of names or something that resemble more North American taste, I imagine it actually would have been selling quite nicely. So, this particular copy, as I might have mentioned earlier, this is going to Carlos. He's already actually got this as I'm doing this recording here. I'm actually going to go track down an extra copy of this game for my own personal collection, and for those kind of familiar with the channel and everything else going on, I don't exactly collect a lot of sports games. I'd consider this an exception. I could actually recommend looking for this game yourself if you happen to like what you see here. And this is probably actually the longest video recording of this game on YouTube right now. Almost no one talks about it, almost no one seems to know about it. So realistically, I don't think it would even be very costly to get a hold of this game. You can probably find it for very cheap. And I'd actually recommend doing so. And that's my piece on the matter. Thank you all for watching. If you happen to kind of like these sort of mini reviews, specifically kind of talking about things that might have been overlooked, feel free to leave a comment, kind of suggesting you happen to like this sort of thing. If you have any suggestions of something I might look into that might be interesting, also drop that into the comments. And now that I kind of have my equipment set up a little more to my liking to kind of run things off actual systems and be able to record things that way, I believe that's actually going to be incorporated more within my next handful of upcoming videos that I've currently been planning out, and well, we'll be recording shortly. So thank you all for watching. based on the date. If I don't happen to have something else on the next day or so, I want to wish everyone watching this Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, and all that, and hopefully you'll be hearing from me again before the New Year. Thank you all, and take care.